Most people spend their entire lives chasing something invisible. Approval. Recognition. Validation. They want to feel accepted. They want to feel respected. They want to feel important in the eyes of others. And without realizing it, this quiet need begins shaping nearly every decision they make. The way they speak. The way they behave. The way they present themselves to the world. But what most people never stop to ask is a much deeper question. What happens to your self-respect when your sense of worth depends on the opinions of others? Because the moment your value depends on external approval, something dangerous begins happening. Your emotional stability becomes fragile. A compliment makes you feel confident. A criticism makes you feel insecure. A moment of praise lifts your mood. A moment of rejection shakes your identity. And suddenly your inner state is no longer yours. It is controlled by the reactions of the world around you. But something interesting begins happening when a person stops chasing validation. Their relationship with themselves begins to change. Because validation creates a subtle psychological trap. It trains the mind to look outward for confirmation. Instead of asking, "Do I respect my choices?" the mind begins asking, "Do others approve of my choices?" And this shift quietly weakens self-respect. Because when approval becomes the goal, authenticity becomes risky. You begin adjusting your behavior. Softening your opinions. Hiding parts of yourself that might be misunderstood. All in exchange for acceptance. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Approval is one of the most unstable currencies in the world. People change their opinions constantly. What is admired today may be criticized tomorrow. What is praised in one environment may be rejected in another. And if your identity depends on that approval, your confidence will always remain unstable. But something powerful happens the moment you stop trying to impress everyone. You begin reclaiming authority over your own life. Because self-respect does not grow from applause. It grows from alignment. Alignment between your values and your actions. Alignment between what you believe and how you live. And when those two things align, validation becomes unnecessary. But the psychology of validation goes even deeper than most people realize. Human beings are wired for belonging. From an evolutionary perspective, acceptance meant survival. Being rejected by the tribe thousands of years ago could mean danger. Isolation. Even death. So the brain developed powerful emotional responses to social approval. Rejection feels painful. Criticism feels threatening. Because deep inside the mind, these signals once carried survival importance. But the modern world is very different from the ancient world. Today, disagreement does not threaten survival. Criticism does not remove you from society. Yet the emotional mechanism still exists. And this is why validation becomes addictive. The brain interprets approval as safety. It rewards approval with dopamine. A psychological signal that reinforces the behavior. And slowly, people become conditioned. They begin chasing approval the same way someone chases a reward. But this is where things become interesting. The more someone chases validation, the less confident they appear. And confidence is one of the most powerful signals of self-respect. Because true confidence does not ask for permission to exist. It does not constantly check whether others approve. It simply acts according to internal clarity. But when a person constantly seeks validation, others notice the hesitation. The subtle need for approval. And ironically, the very thing they are chasing becomes harder to obtain. Because people naturally respect individuals who respect themselves. Not individuals who constantly ask for reassurance. But something even deeper happens when someone breaks free from validation seeking. They begin experiencing a new kind of psychological freedom. The freedom to speak honestly. The freedom to make decisions without constant fear of judgment. The freedom to pursue goals that matter to them, even when others do not understand. And this freedom is the foundation of self-respect. Because self-respect grows from independence. Not independence from relationships. But independence from emotional dependency on approval. But there is another psychological shift that happens during this transformation. You stop interpreting disagreement as rejection. Many people feel threatened when others disagree with them. They interpret disagreement as criticism. And criticism as personal attack. But mentally independent individuals see disagreement differently. They see it as perspective. Different experiences create different opinions. Different values create different conclusions. And disagreement becomes normal rather than threatening. But the real shift happens at a much deeper level. You begin evaluating yourself differently. Instead of asking, "Do people like me?" you begin asking, "Am I living according to my values?" Instead of asking, "Did I impress them?" you begin asking, "Did I act with integrity?" And this internal evaluation system creates stability. Because your self-respect no longer depends on external reactions. It depends on internal alignment. But this transformation does not happen instantly. Breaking free from validation seeking requires awareness. It requires noticing how often decisions are influenced by approval. How often opinions are softened to avoid disagreement. How often authenticity is traded for acceptance. And once you begin noticing these patterns, something powerful happens. You begin reclaiming your identity. Because the version of yourself that constantly seeks validation is not your true self. It is a socially adjusted version. A version shaped by expectations. By fear of rejection. By the desire to fit in. But beneath that layer exists something far more powerful. Your authentic perspective. Your real values. Your genuine voice. And when you stop seeking validation, that voice becomes stronger. But what most people never expect is this. The moment you stop chasing approval, something surprising begins happening. Respect begins to grow. Not because you demanded it. But because you no longer depend on it. And that quiet independence changes how others see you. Because people instinctively recognize self-respect. It appears in posture. In speech. In decisions. And once that self-respect becomes visible, validation becomes unnecessary. But this is only the beginning of the transformation. Because the deeper psychology behind validation seeking reveals something even more powerful. And understanding that psychology is where true self-respect begins to develop. Once you begin observing the need for validation, something surprising becomes visible. You start noticing how deeply it shapes everyday behavior. People rarely admit that they want approval. But their actions often reveal it. They carefully choose words to avoid disagreement. They adjust opinions depending on the audience. They laugh at jokes they do not actually find funny. They hide interests that might seem unusual. And over time, these small adjustments create a quiet disconnection from authenticity. Because the more someone performs for approval, the further they move from their real identity. But the strange part is that most of this behavior happens unconsciously. People do not wake up thinking, Today I will sacrifice my authenticity for validation. It happens slowly. Through social conditioning. Through childhood experiences. Through environments where approval was rewarded and disagreement was discouraged. But something deeper happens inside the mind when validation becomes a habit. The brain begins associating self-worth with reaction. If others approve, you feel valuable. If others criticize, you feel inadequate. And this creates a fragile emotional system. Because your internal state becomes dependent on external responses. A single negative comment can disturb your confidence. A moment of silence after speaking can create doubt. And gradually, the mind becomes hyper-aware of social signals. But this is where things become even more interesting. The people who appear the most confident are often the ones who need validation the least. Not because they reject connection. But because their identity is not built on constant reassurance. They know who they are. They know what they value. And they are comfortable allowing others to disagree. This is the foundation of psychological independence. Because self-respect grows when approval stops being necessary for emotional stability. But here is something many people misunderstand. Stopping the search for validation does not mean becoming arrogant. It does not mean ignoring feedback. And it certainly does not mean believing you are always right. Instead, it means something much healthier. It means shifting the source of evaluation. Instead of constantly asking the world for confirmation, you begin developing internal standards. You evaluate your behavior according to your own values. Your integrity. Your effort. Your growth. And once that internal compass becomes strong, external reactions lose their power. Because your identity no longer depends on them. But the psychology behind validation goes even deeper than approval. At its core, validation seeking is often connected to fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of exclusion. Fear of being misunderstood. And these fears are powerful emotional forces. They push people to adjust their identity to maintain social harmony. But here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Trying to be accepted by everyone is impossible. Different people have different expectations. Different values. Different interpretations of behavior. And when someone tries to satisfy all of them, they end up losing themselves in the process. But something remarkable happens when a person finally accepts that universal approval is impossible. The pressure disappears. Because the goal changes. Instead of trying to be liked by everyone, you begin focusing on being respected by yourself. And this shift creates something far more powerful than approval. It creates authenticity. Authenticity is one of the most powerful signals of self-respect. Because authentic people are not constantly adjusting themselves to fit expectations. They express their real perspective. They maintain their values. They allow disagreement without feeling threatened. And this consistency creates trust. People may not always agree with them. But they recognize the stability of their character. But here is where the psychology becomes even more fascinating. When someone stops chasing validation, they often become more respected. Because approval seeking often appears as insecurity. People can sense when someone is constantly looking for reassurance. But calm self-assurance sends a different signal. It communicates emotional stability. And emotional stability is naturally respected. But the transformation does not happen instantly. Because the habit of validation seeking is deeply rooted. The mind has practiced it for years. Sometimes decades. It appears in subtle ways. checking reactions after speaking, overthinking how something was perceived, replaying conversations in your mind to evaluate how others interpreted your words. And breaking this habit requires awareness. You must notice the moments when the mind seeks approval. Notice the impulse to explain yourself excessively. Notice the desire to adjust your behavior for acceptance. And once those patterns become visible, something powerful happens. You begin creating distance from them. Because awareness interrupts unconscious behavior. But the real shift happens at a deeper psychological level. You begin redefining success. Success stops meaning being admired. Instead, success begins meaning something much more meaningful. Living according to your principles. Acting with integrity even when approval is uncertain. Expressing truth without unnecessary fear. And this redefinition strengthens self-respect. Because self-respect grows through consistency. Consistency between what you believe and how you behave. But something even more powerful emerges from this transformation. Freedom. Freedom from constant performance. Freedom from the pressure to impress. Freedom from the exhausting need to manage how others see you. And with that freedom comes a new kind of confidence. A quiet confidence. Not loud. Not defensive. Not dependent on applause. But steady. Grounded. Authentic. And this kind of confidence has a unique psychological effect. It makes validation unnecessary. Because when you truly respect yourself, the opinions of others become information. Not identity. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more surprising. Because the moment you stop chasing validation, people begin responding to you differently. And understanding why that happens reveals an important truth about human nature. Once you begin observing the need for validation, something surprising becomes visible. You start noticing how deeply it shapes everyday behavior. People rarely admit that they want approval. But their actions often reveal it. They carefully choose words to avoid disagreement. They adjust opinions depending on the audience. They laugh at jokes they do not actually find funny. They hide interests that might seem unusual. And over time, these small adjustments create a quiet disconnection from authenticity. Because the more someone performs for approval, the further they move from their real identity. But the strange part is that most of this behavior happens unconsciously. People do not wake up thinking, "Today I will sacrifice my authenticity for validation." It happens slowly. Through social conditioning. Through childhood experiences. Through environments where approval was rewarded and disagreement was discouraged. But something deeper happens inside the mind when validation becomes a habit. The brain begins associating self-worth with reaction. If others approve, you feel valuable. If others criticize, you feel inadequate. And this creates a fragile emotional system. Because your internal state becomes dependent on external responses. A single negative comment can disturb your confidence. A moment of silence after speaking can create doubt. And gradually, the mind becomes hyper-aware of social signals. But this is where things become even more interesting. The people who appear the most confident are often the ones who need validation the least. Not because they reject connection, but because their identity is not built on constant reassurance. They know who they are. They know what they value. And they are comfortable allowing others to disagree. This is the foundation of psychological independence. Because self-respect grows when approval stops being necessary for emotional stability. But here is something many people misunderstand. Stopping the search for validation does not mean becoming arrogant. It does not mean ignoring feedback. And it certainly does not mean believing you are always right. Instead, it means something much healthier. It means shifting the source of evaluation. Instead of constantly asking the world for confirmation, you begin developing internal standards. You evaluate your behavior according to your own values, your integrity, your effort, your growth. And once that internal compass becomes strong, external reactions lose their power. Because your identity no longer depends on them. But the psychology behind validation goes even deeper than approval. At its core, validation seeking is often connected to fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of exclusion. Fear of being misunderstood. And these fears are powerful emotional forces. They push people to adjust their identity to maintain social harmony. But here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Trying to be accepted by everyone is impossible. Different people have different expectations, different values, different interpretations of behavior. And when someone tries to satisfy all of them, they end up losing themselves in the process. But something remarkable happens when a person finally accepts that universal approval is impossible. The pressure disappears. Because the goal changes. Instead of trying to be liked by everyone, you begin focusing on being respected by yourself. And this shift creates something far more powerful than approval. It creates authenticity. Authenticity is one of the most powerful signals of self-respect. Because authentic people are not constantly adjusting themselves to fit expectations. They express their real perspective. They maintain their values. They allow disagreement without feeling threatened. And this consistency creates trust. People may not always agree with them. But they recognize the stability of their character. But here is where the psychology becomes even more fascinating. When someone stops chasing validation, they often become more respected. Because approval seeking often appears as insecurity. People can sense when someone is constantly looking for reassurance. But calm self-assurance sends a different signal. It communicates emotional stability. And emotional stability is naturally respected. But the transformation does not happen instantly. Because the habit of validation seeking is deeply rooted. The mind has practiced it for years. Sometimes decades. It appears in subtle ways. Checking reactions after speaking. Overthinking how something was perceived. Replaying conversations in your mind to evaluate how others interpreted your words. And breaking this habit requires awareness. You must notice the moments when the mind seeks approval. Notice the impulse to explain yourself excessively. Notice the desire to adjust your behavior for acceptance. And once those patterns become visible, something powerful happens. You begin creating distance from them. Because awareness interrupts unconscious behavior. But the real shift happens at a deeper psychological level. You begin redefining success. Success stops meaning being admired. Instead, success begins meaning something much more meaningful. Living according to your principles. Acting with integrity even when approval is uncertain. Expressing truth without unnecessary fear. And this redefinition strengthens self-respect. Because self-respect grows through consistency. Consistency between what you believe and how you behave. But something even more powerful emerges from this transformation. Freedom. Freedom from constant performance. Freedom from the pressure to impress. Freedom from the exhausting need to manage how others see you. And with that freedom comes a new kind of confidence. A quiet confidence. Not loud. Not defensive. Not dependent on applause. But steady. Grounded. Authentic. And this kind of confidence has a unique psychological effect. It makes validation unnecessary. Because when you truly respect yourself, the opinions of others become information. Not identity. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more surprising. Because the moment you stop chasing validation, people begin responding to you differently. And understanding why that happens reveals an important truth about human nature. As the need for validation begins fading, something subtle starts forming inside the mind. A new reference point. Before this transformation, most people measure themselves through the reactions of others. Did they approve? Did they agree? Did they admire what I said or did? But when validation loses its power, this external measurement system slowly disappears. And something much stronger replaces it. Internal evaluation. Instead of asking the world who you are, you begin defining that answer for yourself. But this shift does not happen instantly. Because for many people, validation has been the main compass guiding behavior for years. Sometimes decades. From childhood, approval often shaped identity. Good behavior was rewarded with praise. Achievement was rewarded with recognition. Obedience was rewarded with acceptance. And slowly, the brain learned a powerful association. Approval equals worth. But the moment a person begins questioning this association, something changes. They start recognizing how much of their identity was constructed around expectation rather than authenticity. They notice how often their behavior was adjusted to avoid criticism. How often opinions were softened to maintain acceptance. How often decisions were influenced by the fear of being misunderstood. And this awareness is the beginning of psychological independence. Because once the pattern becomes visible, it becomes possible to change it. But something else begins happening during this stage. You become more comfortable with disagreement. Earlier in life, disagreement often felt threatening. It created tension. It triggered defensiveness. Because disagreement felt like rejection. But mentally independent individuals eventually realize something important. Disagreement is normal. Different perspectives are inevitable. Every person experiences life through a unique set of experiences, beliefs, and values. And expecting everyone to agree is unrealistic. Once this realization becomes clear, disagreement stops feeling personal. It becomes intellectual. An exchange of viewpoints rather than a threat to identity. But the real shift happens at a much deeper level. You begin redefining the meaning of respect. Many people believe respect must be given by others. They believe it is something earned through recognition. Through status. Through approval. But real self-respect does not come from external recognition. It comes from internal alignment. Alignment between what you believe and how you behave. Alignment between your values and your actions. And when those two align consistently, something powerful happens. Your identity stabilizes. Because it no longer depends on unpredictable external reactions. But there is another psychological change that occurs during this process. You become less reactive to social judgment. Judgment loses much of its emotional impact. Not because you stop caring completely. But because you stop allowing judgment to define your worth. You recognize that every person evaluates the world through their own perspective. their own expectations, their own insecurities. And sometimes criticism reveals more about the person giving it than the person receiving it. This understanding creates emotional distance. Distance between your identity and the opinions of others. But emotional distance does not mean emotional coldness. Mentally independent individuals still listen carefully. They still value meaningful feedback. But they filter it through internal clarity. They ask a simple question. Is this feedback aligned with my values and growth? If yes, they consider it thoughtfully. If not, they release it without emotional attachment. And this filtering process protects self-respect. Because not every opinion deserves influence. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of constant comparison. Comparison is one of the strongest enemies of self-respect. People constantly measure themselves against others. Their success. Their lifestyle. Their progress. And this comparison often creates dissatisfaction. Because someone will always appear ahead in some way. But mentally independent individuals eventually abandon this habit. They recognize that every life follows a different path. Different opportunities. Different challenges. Different timing. And once this perspective becomes clear, comparison loses its emotional grip. Your focus returns to personal growth. To your own development. Your own values. Your own direction. But the psychology of self-respect also reshapes your relationship with mistakes. Many people feel ashamed when they make mistakes. They interpret mistakes as proof of inadequacy. But mentally independent individuals view mistakes differently. Mistakes are information. They reveal gaps in knowledge. They reveal areas for improvement. And when mistakes are interpreted this way, they lose their emotional weight. Instead of damaging identity, they contribute to growth. But something even more powerful begins appearing during this stage. Your behavior becomes more consistent. Because decisions are no longer controlled by the fear of judgment. You speak honestly when necessary. You pursue goals that align with your values. You maintain boundaries when situations conflict with your principles. And this consistency strengthens self-respect. Because every time your behavior aligns with your beliefs, your internal identity becomes clearer. But the most surprising result of this transformation is something many people never expect. When you stop trying to impress others, people often respect you more. Because authenticity is rare. Confidence without arrogance is rare. Calm independence is rare. And people instinctively recognize it when they see it. But this is only one layer of the transformation. Because the deeper psychology of validation reveals something even more fascinating. The people who truly respect themselves do not chase approval. Yet approval often follows them naturally. And understanding why that happens reveals a powerful truth about human behavior. Part 5, 1400 words. Once a person stops chasing validation, a fascinating psychological shift begins to appear in the way others respond to them. It is subtle. Almost invisible at first. But over time, it becomes impossible to ignore. People begin taking them more seriously. Their words carry more weight. Their presence feels more grounded. And the strange part is that this change happens without effort. Because respect is rarely earned through performance. It is earned through stability. Most people try to gain respect by impressing others. They speak louder. They try to appear more knowledgeable. They attempt to demonstrate competence in every conversation. But this effort often produces the opposite result. Because when someone tries too hard to prove themselves, it reveals insecurity. And insecurity weakens the perception of confidence. But mentally independent individuals behave differently. They do not rush to prove themselves. They do not feel the need to dominate conversations. They are comfortable listening. Comfortable observing. Comfortable speaking only when something meaningful needs to be said. And this calm behavior creates a powerful psychological effect. It signals internal security. Because when someone does not feel the need to constantly demonstrate their worth, it suggests that their worth is already understood internally. But something even deeper happens when validation loses its influence. You begin developing boundaries. Before this transformation, many people struggle with boundaries. They say yes when they want to say no. They tolerate behavior that conflicts with their values. They remain silent in situations where honesty would be healthier. Why? Because they fear losing approval. They fear disappointing others. But mentally independent individuals recognize something important. Respect requires boundaries. Without boundaries, identity becomes unclear. People begin adjusting themselves constantly to meet external expectations. And over time, this erodes self-respect. But boundaries restore clarity. They communicate values. They communicate priorities. They communicate what behavior is acceptable and what is not. And while boundaries may occasionally create discomfort, they also create respect. Because people instinctively recognize when someone protects their principles. But there is another psychological layer to validation that most people overlook. Validation seeking often creates emotional dependency. A person begins relying on external reactions to regulate their mood. Praise lifts their confidence. Criticism damages it. And their emotional state becomes tied to social feedback. But mentally independent individuals break this cycle. Their emotional stability becomes self-regulated. They appreciate positive feedback. They learn from constructive criticism. But their identity does not fluctuate with every reaction. And this emotional independence creates something incredibly powerful. Consistency. Consistency in behavior. Consistency in mindset. Consistency in character. And consistency is one of the strongest signals of reliability. People trust individuals who remain stable regardless of external circumstances. But emotional independence also transforms your relationship with attention. Many people unconsciously seek attention as a substitute for respect. They believe visibility equals importance. Recognition equals value. But attention and respect are very different things. Attention can be temporary. Attention can be superficial. Attention can even be negative. But respect grows slowly. It develops through consistency, integrity, reliability. And mentally independent individuals understand this difference. They are not interested in being noticed. They are interested in being authentic. But perhaps the most interesting change happens in communication. When validation stops being the goal, conversations become simpler. You stop trying to impress people with knowledge. You stop exaggerating accomplishments. You stop performing for approval. Instead, communication becomes honest, direct, clear. And people sense that authenticity immediately. Because most conversations are filled with subtle performance. People trying to appear intelligent. Trying to appear confident. Trying to maintain a certain image. But when someone speaks without that pressure, their words feel genuine. And genuine communication builds trust quickly. But the journey toward self-respect also requires accepting something many people avoid. You will not be liked by everyone. No matter how thoughtful you are. No matter how careful you are. No matter how kind you are. Someone will disagree with you. Someone will misunderstand you. Someone will criticize you. And once you accept this reality, something liberating happens. The pressure to be universally accepted disappears. Because you recognize that approval is subjective. Different people admire different qualities. Different people value different behaviors. And trying to satisfy every expectation is impossible. But self-respect does not require universal approval. It requires internal alignment. And when alignment becomes the priority, life becomes simpler. Decisions become clearer. Relationships become more authentic. And emotional stability becomes stronger. But the deeper psychology behind validation reveals an even more important truth. Many people do not realize how much of their stress comes from trying to manage how others perceive them. They analyze every interaction. They replay conversations in their minds. They wonder if something they said was interpreted incorrectly. And this constant mental analysis drains enormous amounts of energy. But mentally independent individuals eventually release this burden. They speak clearly. They act with integrity. And they allow others to interpret their actions however they choose. Because they understand something powerful. You cannot control how others perceive you. But you can control how you conduct yourself. And this understanding removes an enormous amount of psychological pressure. But something even deeper begins to emerge once this pressure disappears. A new level of confidence begins forming. Not confidence built on applause. But confidence built on self-trust. And self-trust is the true foundation of self-respect. Because once you trust your own judgment, the opinions of others become far less intimidating. But the deeper transformation of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. Because when someone truly stops seeking validation, they begin discovering a form of freedom that most people never experience. And that freedom changes everything about the way they live. Part 6, 1400 words. When a person finally begins experiencing life without the constant need for validation, something extraordinary happens. Life becomes quieter. Not quieter externally. The world is still full of opinions, expectations, and judgments. But internally, something changes. The noise fades. Because much of the mental noise people experience comes from trying to manage how they appear in the eyes of others. They analyze every word they say. They replay conversations repeatedly. They imagine how people interpreted their actions. And this constant mental monitoring drains enormous emotional energy. But once validation stops being the goal, the mind no longer needs to perform this exhausting analysis. You speak honestly. You act according to your values. And then you move forward. No endless replay. No obsessive overthinking. Just clarity. But something even deeper begins happening when the mind becomes quieter. Self-trust begins growing. Self-trust is one of the most powerful psychological foundations a person can develop. Because when you trust your own judgment, decision-making becomes simpler. You stop waiting for permission. You stop needing constant reassurance. You evaluate situations thoughtfully, make a choice, and accept responsibility for the outcome. And this responsibility strengthens identity. Because every decision made with clarity reinforces your sense of direction. But validation seeking often prevents this process. When someone constantly asks others what they should do, they weaken their own decision-making ability. They outsource judgment. They rely on approval before taking action. And over time, this habit erodes self-trust. Because the mind stops practicing independent thinking. But mentally independent individuals develop a different approach. They listen to advice. They consider perspectives. But the final decision remains theirs. And this ownership creates psychological strength. Because self-respect grows when you take responsibility for your choices. But something else begins emerging during this transformation. You become more comfortable with uncertainty. Many people seek validation because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. They want confirmation that their choices are correct. They want reassurance that their direction is safe. But mentally independent individuals accept something important. Uncertainty is part of growth. No meaningful path comes with complete guarantees. Every ambitious decision involves risk. Every new direction involves unknown outcomes. And once you accept uncertainty as a natural part of life, the need for validation decreases. Because validation is often a substitute for certainty. But self-trust replaces that need. You trust your ability to adapt. To learn. To adjust if necessary. And this adaptability makes uncertainty less intimidating. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of emotional overreaction. When validation controls identity, criticism feels threatening. Even small comments can trigger defensive reactions. But once self-respect becomes internal, emotional reactions soften. You begin responding instead of reacting. There is space between stimulus and response. Someone criticizes your idea. Instead of reacting emotionally, you evaluate it calmly. Is the criticism valid? If yes, you learn from it. If not, you release it without emotional attachment. And this calm response creates stability. Because emotional reactions often escalate situations unnecessarily. But calm responses often diffuse them. But emotional independence also changes the way you experience social situations. Many people feel pressure in conversations. Pressure to say the right thing. Pressure to appear intelligent. Pressure to maintain a certain image. But mentally independent individuals experience conversations differently. They are not performing. They are participating. They listen carefully. They speak honestly. They allow moments of silence without discomfort. And this relaxed communication style creates authentic connections. Because people feel more comfortable around individuals who are not constantly performing for approval. But another interesting shift happens in how you handle praise. Earlier in life, praise may have felt extremely important. A confirmation of worth. A boost of confidence. But once self-respect becomes internal, praise loses its emotional intensity. You appreciate it. But you do not depend on it. Because your identity no longer depends on external recognition. And this emotional balance creates stability. But perhaps the most important change during this stage is how you treat yourself internally. Validation seeking often creates harsh self-criticism. People judge themselves according to how others might perceive them. They replay mistakes repeatedly. They imagine how others interpreted their failures. But mentally independent individuals develop a healthier internal dialogue. They still hold themselves accountable. But they do not punish themselves unnecessarily. Mistakes become lessons. Setbacks become information. And this perspective supports growth instead of shame. But something even more fascinating begins emerging as self-respect deepens. Your goals begin changing. Before this transformation, many goals may have been influenced by external expectations. Career choices that impress others. Achievements that attract admiration. Lifestyle decisions that signal success. But mentally independent individuals eventually redefine success. Success becomes alignment. Living according to your values. Pursuing goals that feel meaningful. Contributing in ways that feel authentic. And this redefinition creates fulfillment. Because goals aligned with personal values create lasting motivation. But goals driven by validation often create pressure instead of satisfaction. But the journey toward self-respect also reveals something deeper about human psychology. People respect individuals who respect themselves. Not individuals who constantly ask for reassurance. Because self-respect communicates stability. It communicates clarity. It communicates confidence without arrogance. And people instinctively recognize this presence. But the deeper psychology of validation reveals something even more powerful. The moment you stop chasing approval, your identity becomes clearer. And once identity becomes clear, the world begins responding to you differently. Because clarity is magnetic. And understanding why clarity attracts respect reveals something profound about human nature. When self-respect begins replacing the need for validation, a new type of clarity emerges in everyday life. You start noticing patterns that were previously invisible. Patterns in behavior. Patterns in conversations. Patterns in how people respond to confidence and insecurity. And one of the first patterns that becomes obvious is this. People respond differently to those who respect themselves. Not because self-respecting individuals demand attention. But because their behavior communicates stability. They are not constantly adjusting themselves to please others. They are not apologizing for their presence. They are not seeking permission to express their thoughts. Instead, they carry themselves with quiet certainty. And that certainty sends a powerful psychological signal. It signals that their identity is not fragile. But here is something many people misunderstand about self-respect. Self-respect does not mean becoming stubborn. It does not mean refusing feedback. And it certainly does not mean believing you are always correct. True self-respect is actually flexible. Because a person who respects themselves does not fear learning. They do not fear adjusting their perspective. They do not fear admitting mistakes. Because their identity is not threatened by growth. In fact, growth strengthens their identity. But something else begins happening during this stage. Your tolerance for superficial approval decreases. Earlier in life, praise may have felt exciting. Compliments may have felt deeply rewarding. But mentally independent individuals eventually notice something interesting. Not all praise is meaningful. Some praise is given casually. Some praise is given to maintain politeness. Some praise is given without genuine understanding. And once you recognize this, praise loses its emotional intensity. You appreciate sincere recognition. But you no longer rely on it to feel valuable. Because self-respect already provides that stability internally. But emotional independence also transforms the way you observe social dynamics. You begin noticing how many people perform roles rather than expressing authenticity. Some people perform confidence. Others perform intelligence. Others perform friendliness. And often these performances are designed to attract validation. To create approval. To maintain a certain image. But mentally independent individuals eventually release the need for performance. They speak when they have something meaningful to say. They remain silent when conversation adds no value. They allow their presence to exist without constant justification. And this authenticity feels refreshing to others. Because in a world full of performance, authenticity stands out immediately. But there is another psychological shift that appears during this transformation. You begin feeling more comfortable with solitude. Validation seeking often creates discomfort with being alone. Because when someone depends on approval, isolation removes that feedback. Without external reactions, they may feel uncertain about their identity. But mentally independent individuals experience solitude differently. Solitude becomes a space for clarity. A space for reflection. A space where identity is not influenced by constant social feedback. And within that quiet space, self-awareness deepens. But self-awareness also reveals something important. Many of the fears connected to validation are exaggerated. People often fear rejection. They fear criticism. They fear being misunderstood. But once you experience life without constantly chasing approval, you begin noticing something surprising. Most people are far more focused on themselves than on judging others. They are thinking about their own challenges, their own insecurities, their own decisions. And this realization removes much of the imagined pressure surrounding social judgment. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the development of internal consistency. Internal consistency means that your actions align with your beliefs. You do not behave one way in private and another way in public. You do not change your values depending on the environment. Instead, your behavior reflects your principles consistently. And this consistency strengthens identity. Because every time you act according to your values, your self-respect grows stronger. But validation seeking often weakens this consistency. People adjust their opinions depending on who they are speaking with. They soften their views to avoid disagreement. They change their behavior to maintain acceptance. And slowly, identity becomes fragmented. But self-respect restores that unity. Your beliefs become clear. Your behavior becomes aligned. Your identity becomes stable. And stability creates confidence. But perhaps the most fascinating psychological change during this stage is the disappearance of excessive explanation. Many people feel the need to constantly justify their decisions. They explain their choices repeatedly. They defend their boundaries excessively. Why? Because they want approval. They want reassurance that their decisions are acceptable. But mentally independent individuals eventually stop over-explaining. They communicate clearly. But they do not feel obligated to convince everyone. Because self-respect does not require universal agreement. And this quiet certainty changes the way others perceive them. Their words carry more weight. Their decisions appear more deliberate. Their presence feels more grounded. But the deeper psychology behind validation reveals something even more powerful. The moment you stop trying to impress people, you begin revealing your true identity. And that authenticity becomes the foundation of lasting confidence. But the transformation does not end here. Because once self-respect becomes internal, something even more important begins to develop. A deep sense of personal responsibility for the direction of your life. And understanding how responsibility strengthens self-respect is where the next layer of transformation begins. Part 8, 1400 words. As self-respect begins replacing the constant search for validation, another powerful transformation quietly begins. Responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility that feels like pressure. But the kind that feels like ownership. Because once your identity is no longer built on external approval, something important becomes clear. Your life direction belongs to you. Not to the expectations of others. Not to the opinions of strangers. Not to the social pressure surrounding you. And this realization changes how you approach decisions. Before developing self-respect, many decisions are influenced by how they will be perceived. People choose paths that look impressive. They pursue goals that receive recognition. They follow directions that bring approval. But mentally independent individuals begin asking a different question. Not, what will people think? But, what actually matters to me? And that question creates clarity. Because when a decision aligns with personal values, it becomes easier to commit to. Even when others do not fully understand. But this stage of growth also requires accepting something difficult. You will disappoint people. Not intentionally. Not out of disrespect. But because living according to your values means your decisions will not always align with the expectations of others. Some people may disagree. Some may question your direction. Some may misunderstand your choices. And if validation is still important, these reactions can create doubt. But once self-respect becomes stronger than approval-seeking, these reactions lose their emotional power. You listen respectfully. You consider perspectives thoughtfully. But you remain responsible for your own direction. And this responsibility strengthens identity. But something else happens when a person takes full ownership of their life. Excuses disappear. Validation seeking often creates excuses. People blame circumstances. They blame expectations. They blame social pressure. But mentally independent individuals begin recognizing something deeper. Even when circumstances are difficult, they still have influence over their choices. They still control their effort. They still control their attitude. And this awareness creates empowerment. Because when you accept responsibility for your direction, your life becomes something you shape rather than something you endure. But responsibility also strengthens discipline. Without internal standards, behavior often fluctuates depending on approval. People work hard when they are praised. They lose motivation when recognition disappears. But mentally independent individuals develop internal discipline. They act according to principles rather than applause. They pursue improvement even when nobody is watching. And this discipline strengthens self-respect. Because every action aligned with your values reinforces your identity. But perhaps the most important shift during this stage is the disappearance of emotional dependency. Validation seeking often creates emotional instability. People feel confident when praised. Discouraged when criticized. Motivated when recognized. But once self-respect becomes internal, emotional stability improves dramatically. Because your confidence no longer depends on reactions. It depends on alignment. Alignment between your actions and your standards. And this stability makes challenges easier to navigate. But emotional independence also reshapes your relationships. When someone constantly seeks validation, relationships often become imbalanced. They try too hard to please others. They tolerate behavior that conflicts with their values. They avoid honest conversations to maintain approval. But mentally independent individuals approach relationships differently. They value authenticity. They communicate honestly. They respect others while maintaining boundaries. And this creates healthier relationships. Because genuine connection cannot exist without honesty. But another interesting change happens during this transformation. Your tolerance for manipulation decreases. People who constantly seek validation are easier to influence. Because approval becomes a tool. Compliments can persuade them. Criticism can control them. But once self-respect becomes internal, manipulation loses its power. Because your decisions are no longer driven by approval. They are driven by values. And values cannot be easily manipulated. But perhaps the most fascinating transformation during this stage is the emergence of calm confidence. Not loud confidence. Not aggressive confidence. But quiet confidence. The kind that appears when someone knows who they are. The kind that does not need constant reassurance. The kind that remains steady regardless of external reactions. And this quiet confidence influences others. Because people instinctively trust individuals who appear emotionally stable. They sense reliability. They sense clarity. They sense strength. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. When someone truly respects themselves, they stop trying to control how others perceive them. This is one of the most liberating realizations a person can experience. Because controlling perception is impossible. Different people interpret behavior differently. Different people hold different expectations. And no matter how carefully you act, someone will misunderstand. But mentally independent individuals accept this reality. They focus on integrity. They act according to their values. And they allow others to interpret their behavior however they choose. Because self-respect does not require universal approval. It requires internal consistency. But the transformation of self-respect continues revealing deeper insights. Because once responsibility becomes natural, something even more powerful begins developing. A new level of emotional resilience. The ability to remain steady even when the world around you becomes uncertain. And understanding how resilience strengthens self-respect reveals one of the most powerful psychological truths about human strength. Once responsibility and self-respect become part of your identity, another powerful transformation begins unfolding. Resilience. Not the dramatic kind people often imagine. Not the kind that appears only during extreme hardship. But quiet resilience. The kind that appears in everyday moments. In criticism. In rejection. In misunderstandings. Because when validation controls identity, these moments feel threatening. A single negative comment can disturb your confidence. A disagreement can create doubt. A setback can feel like proof of failure. But mentally independent individuals experience these situations differently. They still notice them. They still evaluate them. But they do not collapse emotionally because of them. And this emotional stability creates resilience. Because resilience is not about avoiding difficulty. It is about remaining steady during it. But something interesting happens when validation loses its influence. Rejection stops feeling like a personal attack. Many people interpret rejection as proof of inadequacy. If someone disagrees with them, they assume they are wrong. If someone criticizes them, they assume they are flawed. But mentally independent individuals recognize something important. Rejection is often about alignment, not worth. Different people seek different things. Different environments value different qualities. Different opportunities require different strengths. And once this becomes clear, rejection becomes less emotional. It becomes informational. A signal that something was not aligned. But not a verdict on identity. And this perspective protects self-respect. But emotional resilience also changes how you handle setbacks. Earlier in life, setbacks often feel discouraging. They create frustration. They create doubt. They create hesitation. But mentally independent individuals begin interpreting setbacks differently. They see them as part of the process. Because every meaningful path includes obstacles. Every ambitious goal includes challenges. And once setbacks become expected rather than feared, they lose their emotional weight. Instead of reacting emotionally, the mind becomes analytical. What can be learned? What can be improved? What can be adjusted? And this analytical mindset strengthens resilience. But resilience also strengthens patience. Validation seeking often creates urgency. People want immediate results. Immediate recognition. Immediate approval. But mentally independent individuals understand something deeper. Real growth takes time. Real mastery takes time. Real respect takes time. And patience becomes easier when approval is no longer the primary goal. Because the focus shifts from impressing others to improving yourself. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of emotional fragility. Emotional fragility appears when identity is weak. When self-worth depends heavily on external reactions. But once self-respect becomes internal, emotional stability strengthens. Criticism becomes easier to hear. Failure becomes easier to process. Uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate. And this emotional strength creates confidence. Not because life becomes easier, but because you trust your ability to handle difficulty. But emotional resilience also transforms your mindset toward risk. Many people avoid risk because they fear judgment. They fear embarrassment. They fear failure in the eyes of others. But mentally independent individuals approach risk differently. They understand that growth requires experimentation. Trying new things. Making mistakes. Learning through experience. And once fear of judgment disappears, risk becomes less intimidating. Because the worst outcome is no longer humiliation. The worst outcome is simply information. Information about what works and what does not. But perhaps the most surprising change during this stage is how you experience pressure. Pressure often comes from the need to perform for approval. To prove competence. To maintain reputation. But when self-respect becomes internal, much of this pressure disappears. Because your goal is no longer to impress. Your goal is to improve. And improvement is a process, not a performance. But resilience also strengthens emotional control. Many people react impulsively during stressful situations. They become defensive. They raise their voice. They speak without thinking. But mentally independent individuals pause. They observe the situation carefully. They respond thoughtfully. And this calm response often changes the entire dynamic of the situation. Because emotional escalation requires participation. Without reaction, conflict loses momentum. But perhaps the most important realization during this stage is this. Your value does not decrease because someone fails to recognize it. Your value does not disappear because someone misunderstands you. Your value does not change because someone disagrees with your choices. Your value comes from alignment. Alignment between your values and your actions. Alignment between who you are and how you live. And when this alignment becomes consistent, your self-respect becomes stable. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. When resilience becomes natural, a new form of confidence begins appearing. Confidence not built on success alone. but confidence built on the ability to recover from failure. And that kind of confidence is far more powerful than the fragile confidence built on validation. Because it remains steady regardless of outcomes. But this transformation continues evolving. Because once resilience becomes part of identity, something even deeper begins developing. A level of emotional control that allows you to remain calm even in situations where most people lose their balance. And understanding this emotional control reveals one of the most important secrets behind lasting self-respect. As resilience strengthens and validation loses its influence, another powerful ability begins to develop. Emotional control. Not the kind that suppresses feelings, but the kind that guides them. Because emotions themselves are not the problem. They are signals. Signals about how the mind interprets a situation. But the problem appears when emotions begin controlling behavior. When anger becomes immediate reaction. When fear becomes avoidance. When embarrassment becomes silence. And for people who depend on validation, emotions often react quickly. Criticism triggers defensiveness. Disagreement triggers tension. Judgment triggers insecurity. But mentally independent individuals develop a different relationship with emotions. They observe them. They experience them. But they do not immediately act on them. And this small pause creates enormous psychological power. Because between emotion and action exists a moment of choice. Most people react inside that moment. But emotionally disciplined individuals think. They evaluate the situation. They decide how they want to respond. And this pause protects self-respect. Because impulsive reactions often lead to regret. Words spoken too quickly. Decisions made emotionally. Conflicts escalated unnecessarily. But thoughtful responses maintain stability. But emotional control also transforms communication. Many arguments begin not because people disagree, but because emotions escalate the conversation. A small disagreement becomes personal. A comment becomes an insult. A misunderstanding becomes a conflict. But emotionally disciplined individuals slow the emotional rhythm of conversations. They listen carefully. They respond calmly. They avoid reacting to tone instead of meaning. And this calm presence often prevents conflicts from growing. Because emotional escalation requires participation. Without reaction, tension decreases. But emotional control also strengthens confidence in difficult situations. Most people become anxious when they feel judged. They worry about how they appear. They analyze their behavior constantly. But mentally independent individuals remain calm under observation. Because their identity does not depend on approval. They are not performing. They are simply expressing themselves. And this relaxed presence communicates confidence. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of emotional overthinking. Validation seeking often creates constant mental analysis. People replay conversations repeatedly. They wonder if something they said was misunderstood. They imagine how others interpreted their actions. And this constant analysis drains energy. But emotionally disciplined individuals eventually release this habit. They speak honestly. They act with integrity. And they move forward without obsessively evaluating every interaction. Because once self-respect becomes internal, approval becomes unnecessary. But emotional control also strengthens decision-making. Many decisions become difficult when people fear judgment. They hesitate. They delay. They seek reassurance repeatedly. But mentally independent individuals approach decisions differently. They gather information. They reflect carefully. They make a choice. And they accept responsibility for the outcome. Because responsibility strengthens self-trust. And self-trust strengthens confidence. But emotional discipline also changes how you respond to mistakes. Before developing self-respect, mistakes often feel embarrassing. They create shame. They create fear of judgment. But mentally independent individuals interpret mistakes differently. Mistakes are information. They reveal weaknesses. They reveal opportunities for improvement. And when mistakes are treated as lessons instead of failures, they lose their emotional weight. But something else begins emerging during this stage. Your reactions become slower. More thoughtful. More deliberate. And people notice this difference. Because calm reactions stand out in a world where most people respond impulsively. But emotional control also strengthens your ability to handle criticism. Many people react defensively when criticized. They explain excessively. They justify their actions. They argue. But emotionally disciplined individuals evaluate criticism calmly. They ask a simple question. Is this criticism useful? If yes, they learn from it. If not, they release it without emotional attachment. And this calm evaluation protects self-respect. Because identity no longer depends on approval. But perhaps the most important realization during this stage is this. You cannot control every situation. You cannot control every opinion. You cannot control how others behave. But you can control your response. And that response determines your experience of life. Because reactions shape perception. Perception shapes emotion. And emotion shapes behavior. But once you control your reactions, the world loses much of its power to disturb your peace. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more fascinating. When emotional control becomes natural, people begin trusting your presence. Because calm individuals appear reliable. Their words feel measured. Their decisions feel thoughtful. And this quiet stability attracts respect. Not because they demanded it. But because their behavior demonstrated it. But the journey toward self-respect continues, revealing deeper insights. Because once emotional control becomes consistent, something even more powerful begins developing. A level of internal clarity that makes identity stronger than external expectations. An understanding that clarity reveals one of the most important psychological truths about self-respect and personal freedom. When emotional control becomes part of your character, another transformation begins unfolding quietly. Clarity. Not just clarity about situations. But clarity about yourself. Because when validation controls identity, self-perception becomes blurred. You see yourself through the reactions of others. Praise makes you feel capable. Criticism makes you feel inadequate. And your identity fluctuates depending on external feedback. But mentally independent individuals eventually step outside this cycle. They stop measuring themselves through approval. And they begin observing themselves honestly. This honesty creates clarity. You begin recognizing your strengths without exaggeration. You begin recognizing your weaknesses without shame. And this balanced awareness strengthens self-respect. Because self-respect does not require perfection. It requires honesty. But something interesting happens once this clarity develops. Your priorities begin changing. Earlier in life, many people chase recognition. They pursue achievements that attract admiration. They make decisions that impress others. But mentally independent individuals eventually realize something important. Recognition is temporary. Approval is unstable. Reputation changes quickly. But character remains. And once character becomes the priority, life decisions become clearer. Because you begin asking different questions. Not, will this impress people? But, does this align with my values? Not, will this gain approval? But, does this contribute to who I want to become? And these questions lead to stronger decisions. But clarity also transforms how you handle social pressure. Social pressure often influences behavior without people realizing it. Groups expect conformity. Environments encourage certain attitudes. And many people adjust their behavior automatically to maintain acceptance. But mentally independent individuals recognize these pressures. They observe them carefully. And instead of reacting automatically, they choose consciously. Sometimes they agree. Sometimes they disagree. But the decision comes from internal values rather than fear of rejection. And this independence strengthens identity. But clarity also strengthens emotional boundaries. Many people struggle with boundaries because they fear losing approval. They tolerate behavior that conflicts with their values. They avoid confrontation to maintain harmony. But mentally independent individuals understand something important. Respect requires boundaries. Without boundaries, identity becomes unclear. People begin adjusting themselves constantly to satisfy expectations. And over time, this weakens self-respect. But boundaries restore clarity. They communicate values. They communicate priorities. They communicate what behavior is acceptable and what is not. And while boundaries may occasionally create discomfort, they also create respect. Because people instinctively recognize when someone protects their principles. But clarity also changes the way you observe other people. You begin noticing how many behaviors are driven by insecurity. People trying to impress. People exaggerating accomplishments. People reacting emotionally to protect their image. And this awareness creates understanding. Not judgment. Because you realize how common validation seeking is. But this understanding also protects your peace. Because when someone behaves defensively or critically, you recognize the emotional mechanism behind it. Instead of reacting emotionally, you respond with perspective. But clarity also strengthens focus. Validation seeking often scatters attention. People try to please everyone. They chase multiple directions simultaneously. They adjust their goals according to expectations. But mentally independent individuals simplify their focus. They pursue goals aligned with their values. They invest energy in meaningful directions. And this focused effort produces better results. Because clarity removes distraction. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is internal stability. Before developing self-respect, identity often feels fragile. A small criticism can create doubt. A setback can disturb confidence. But once clarity develops, identity becomes stronger. Because you know who you are. You know what you value. You know what direction you are pursuing. And external reactions no longer redefine your identity. But clarity also strengthens patience. Many people rush decisions because they fear judgment. They want quick results. Quick recognition. Quick validation. But mentally independent individuals move differently. They move deliberately. They take time to evaluate situations. They accept that meaningful progress often requires patience. And this patience protects self-respect. Because rushed decisions often lead to regret. But thoughtful decisions strengthen identity. But something even deeper begins emerging once clarity becomes consistent. Your presence changes. People begin sensing stability in your behavior. They notice the calm way you respond to criticism. The thoughtful way you handle pressure. The confidence you show without seeking approval. And this presence attracts respect naturally. Because people instinctively trust individuals who appear internally grounded. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. When clarity becomes strong enough, external expectations lose their authority. And this creates a level of personal freedom that many people never experience. Because once expectations stop controlling your identity, your life direction becomes truly your own. And that freedom changes everything about how you live, think, and grow. Once clarity and internal stability become part of your mindset, a deeper form of freedom begins emerging. Freedom from expectations. Not the expectations you place on yourself to grow, but the expectations others place on who they believe you should be. Because one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior is the desire to meet expectations. Family expectations. Social expectations. Cultural expectations. And many people unconsciously shape their identity around these forces. They become what others expect rather than discovering who they actually are. But mentally independent individuals eventually recognize this pattern. They notice how often decisions are influenced by approval rather than authenticity. How often people pursue paths that bring admiration rather than fulfillment. And once this awareness appears, something changes. You begin questioning expectations. Not rejecting them blindly, but evaluating them carefully. Does this expectation align with my values? Does it support my growth? Or is it simply a social script that I have been following without reflection? And this evaluation creates freedom. Because many expectations lose their authority once examined honestly. But this stage of growth also requires courage. Because stepping outside expectations often creates misunderstanding. Some people may question your choices. Some may criticize your direction. Some may feel uncomfortable when you refuse to follow familiar patterns. But mentally independent individuals accept this reality. They understand that living authentically will not always be convenient. And they accept the responsibility that comes with independence. Because freedom and responsibility always appear together. But something else begins happening during this stage. Your relationship with success begins changing. Before developing self-respect, success often means recognition, admiration, status. But mentally independent individuals eventually redefine success. Success becomes alignment. Living according to your values. Developing your potential. Contributing meaningfully. And this redefinition creates deeper fulfillment. Because achievements driven by validation often feel empty once recognition fades. But achievements aligned with purpose create lasting satisfaction. But freedom from expectations also transforms your creativity. When people constantly worry about judgment, creativity becomes limited. They avoid unusual ideas. They follow predictable patterns. They hesitate to experiment. But mentally independent individuals think differently. They are comfortable exploring new perspectives. They are willing to challenge assumptions. They are willing to create without needing approval first. And this freedom allows originality to emerge. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is emotional detachment from judgment. Not indifference, but emotional detachment. Many people feel emotionally affected by how others evaluate them. They worry about criticism. They analyze how they appear. They imagine what people might think. But mentally independent individuals eventually release this burden. They accept that judgment is inevitable. Every person interprets behavior through their own experiences, their own beliefs, their own insecurities. And once this becomes clear, judgment loses its emotional power. Because it is no longer interpreted as truth. It becomes perspective. But emotional detachment also strengthens self-trust. Self-trust grows when decisions are made according to internal clarity. Every time you act according to your values rather than external pressure, your confidence increases. Because you prove to yourself that your judgment can be trusted. And this trust strengthens identity. But something even deeper begins emerging once self-trust becomes strong. You stop seeking permission to exist as yourself. Many people unconsciously ask permission through behavior. They soften their opinions. They hide aspects of their personality. They adjust their presence to avoid criticism. But mentally independent individuals stop asking for permission. They express themselves honestly. They pursue their interests confidently. They allow their identity to exist without constant justification. And this authenticity attracts respect. Because authenticity communicates strength. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. When a person stops chasing approval, they begin developing an inner sense of authority. Not authority over others, but authority over their own life. They decide what matters. They decide what direction to pursue. They decide what standards to follow. And this authority creates independence. But independence also strengthens responsibility. Because when your life direction becomes your own choice, excuses lose their power. You cannot blame expectations. You cannot blame approval. Your decisions become yours. And this responsibility strengthens identity. But perhaps the most important realization during this stage is this. You do not need everyone to understand your path. Understanding from others is valuable, but it is not required for self-respect. Because the most important understanding must come from within. Understanding your values. Understanding your direction. Understanding your identity. And once this understanding becomes clear, external opinions lose their influence. But the transformation of self-respect continues evolving. Because once freedom from expectations becomes natural, something even deeper begins developing. A level of emotional strength that allows you to remain steady even when the world around you becomes unpredictable. And understanding that strength reveals one of the most important truths about personal independence and lasting confidence. Once clarity and internal stability become part of your mindset, a deeper form of freedom begins emerging. Freedom from expectations. Not the expectations you place on yourself to grow. But the expectations others place on who they believe you should be. Because one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior is the desire to meet expectations. Family expectations. Social expectations. Cultural expectations. And many people unconsciously shape their identity around these forces. They become what others expect rather than discovering who they actually are. But mentally independent individuals eventually recognize this pattern. They notice how often decisions are influenced by approval rather than authenticity. How often people pursue paths that bring admiration rather than fulfillment. And once this awareness appears, something changes. You begin questioning expectations. Not rejecting them blindly, but evaluating them carefully. Does this expectation align with my values? Does it support my growth? Or is it simply a social script that I have been following without reflection? And this evaluation creates freedom. Because many expectations lose their authority once examined honestly. But this stage of growth also requires courage. Because stepping outside expectations often creates misunderstanding. Some people may question your choices. Some may criticize your direction. Some may feel uncomfortable when you refuse to follow familiar patterns. But mentally independent individuals accept this reality. They understand that living authentically will not always be convenient. And they accept the responsibility that comes with independence. Because freedom and responsibility always appear together. But something else begins happening during this stage. Your relationship with success begins changing. Before developing self-respect, success often means recognition, admiration, status. But mentally independent individuals eventually redefine success. Success becomes alignment. Living according to your values. Developing your potential. Contributing meaningfully. And this redefinition creates deeper fulfillment. Because achievements driven by validation often feel empty once recognition fades. But achievements aligned with purpose create lasting satisfaction. But freedom from expectations also transforms your creativity. When people constantly worry about judgment, creativity becomes limited. They avoid unusual ideas. They follow predictable patterns. They hesitate to experiment. But mentally independent individuals think differently. They are comfortable exploring new perspectives. They are willing to challenge assumptions. They are willing to create without needing approval first. And this freedom allows originality to emerge. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is emotional detachment from judgment. Not indifference, but emotional detachment. Many people feel emotionally affected by how others evaluate them. They worry about criticism. They analyze how they appear. They imagine what people might think. But mentally independent individuals eventually release this burden. They accept that judgment is inevitable. Every person interprets behavior through their own experiences, their own beliefs, their own insecurities. And once this becomes clear, judgment loses its emotional power. Because it is no longer interpreted as truth. It becomes perspective. But emotional detachment also strengthens self-trust. Self-trust grows when decisions are made according to internal clarity. Every time you act according to your values rather than external pressure, your confidence increases. Because you prove to yourself that your judgment can be trusted. And this trust strengthens identity. But something even deeper begins emerging once self-trust becomes strong. You stop seeking permission to exist as yourself. Many people unconsciously ask permission through behavior. They soften their opinions. They hide aspects of their personality. They adjust their presence to avoid criticism. But mentally independent individuals stop asking for permission. They express themselves honestly. They pursue their interests confidently. They allow their identity to exist without constant justification. And this authenticity attracts respect. Because authenticity communicates strength. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. When a person stops chasing approval, they begin developing an inner sense of authority. Not authority over others. but authority over their own life. They decide what matters. They decide what direction to pursue. They decide what standards to follow. And this authority creates independence. But independence also strengthens responsibility. Because when your life direction becomes your own choice, excuses lose their power. You cannot blame expectations. You cannot blame approval. Your decisions become yours. And this responsibility strengthens identity. But perhaps the most important realization during this stage is this. You do not need everyone to understand your path. Understanding from others is valuable, but it is not required for self-respect. Because the most important understanding must come from within. Understanding your values. Understanding your direction. Understanding your identity. And once this understanding becomes clear, external opinions lose their influence. But the transformation of self-respect continues evolving. Because once freedom from expectations becomes natural, something even deeper begins developing. A level of emotional strength that allows you to remain steady even when the world around you becomes unpredictable. And understanding that strength reveals one of the most important truths about personal independence and lasting confidence. Once freedom from expectations becomes natural, a deeper kind of strength begins forming inside the mind. Emotional strength. Not the dramatic strength that appears only during extreme situations. But quiet strength. The kind that allows you to remain steady even when the environment around you becomes unstable. Because life will always include uncertainty. Unexpected changes. Misunderstandings. Moments when plans do not unfold the way you imagined. And when validation controls identity, these moments can feel overwhelming. They create doubt. They create insecurity. They create fear of judgment. But mentally independent individuals experience these moments differently. They do not expect life to be perfectly predictable. They understand that uncertainty is part of every meaningful journey. And this understanding creates emotional resilience. But emotional strength also changes how you interpret obstacles. Many people interpret obstacles as signals to stop. They assume difficulty means something is wrong. They assume resistance means they are not capable. But mentally independent individuals recognize something different. Resistance often appears when growth is happening. Challenges reveal weaknesses that need improvement. Obstacles expose areas that require learning. And instead of reacting emotionally, they become curious. What can this situation teach me? What skills does this challenge require? What adjustments can I make? And this curiosity transforms obstacles into opportunities. But emotional strength also transforms how you experience criticism. Before developing self-respect, criticism often feels threatening. It creates defensive reactions. The mind immediately searches for ways to protect identity. But mentally independent individuals evaluate criticism calmly. They separate emotion from information. They ask a simple question. Is there truth here? If the answer is yes, they learn from it. If the answer is no, they release it without emotional attachment. And this ability to filter criticism protects self-respect. Because identity no longer depends on universal approval. But emotional strength also reshapes your relationship with failure. Many people fear failure because they associate it with judgment. They worry about how others will interpret their mistakes. They imagine embarrassment. They imagine criticism. And this fear often prevents action. But mentally independent individuals view failure differently. Failure is information. Information about strategy. Information about timing. information about preparation. And once failure becomes part of the learning process, fear loses its control. Because failure no longer defines identity. It simply informs improvement. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of emotional fragility. Emotional fragility appears when identity is dependent on external reactions. When approval strengthens confidence. When criticism weakens it. But once self-respect becomes internal, emotional stability increases dramatically. You become less reactive. Less defensive. Less affected by temporary reactions from others. And this stability creates confidence. Because confidence is not built on constant success. Confidence is built on the ability to handle difficulty. But emotional strength also strengthens patience. Many people feel pressure to achieve quickly. To prove themselves. To gain recognition rapidly. But mentally independent individuals understand something deeper. Real growth takes time. Real mastery takes time. Real respect develops gradually. And patience becomes easier when approval is no longer the goal. Because the focus shifts from impressing others to improving yourself. But emotional strength also transforms your mindset toward uncertainty. The future is always uncertain. No one can predict every outcome. No one can control every situation. And validation seeking often creates anxiety about the future. People want reassurance. They want guarantees. They want confirmation that their choices are correct. But mentally independent individuals approach uncertainty differently. They prepare carefully. They improve their skills. They remain adaptable. And then they move forward with confidence. Because they trust their ability to adjust if necessary. But something even deeper begins appearing as emotional strength grows. Your presence changes. People notice the calm way you respond to pressure. The thoughtful way you handle criticism. The confidence you show without arrogance. And this presence attracts respect. Because people instinctively trust individuals who remain steady during difficulty. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more powerful. When emotional strength becomes part of your character, your decisions become clearer. Because decisions are no longer influenced by fear of judgment. They are guided by values. And values provide direction. But perhaps the most important realization during this stage is this. Your worth is not determined by how others respond to you. Your worth is determined by how you live. How you think. How you treat others. How you pursue growth. And once this realization becomes clear, the need for validation fades completely. Because self-respect becomes stronger than approval. But the journey toward self-respect continues, revealing deeper insights. Because once emotional strength becomes stable, something even more powerful begins emerging. A deep sense of inner peace that does not depend on external circumstances. And understanding this peace reveals one of the most important psychological truths about living with confidence and authenticity. As emotional strength becomes stable, a quieter transformation begins emerging beneath it. Inner peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from perfect circumstances. Life rarely offers that. There will always be uncertainty, disagreement, and unexpected change. But the peace that grows from self-respect is different. It is not created by controlling the world. It is created by understanding your place within it. Because once validation stops controlling your identity, the mind becomes less reactive. You no longer interpret every disagreement as a threat. You no longer feel the need to defend your identity constantly. You no longer analyze every opinion that crosses your path. And this reduction in emotional reaction creates mental space. Space where calm thinking can exist. But inner peace also changes the rhythm of your thoughts. Many people live with constant internal noise. Questions about the past. Worries about the future. Concerns about how they are perceived. And this mental noise creates tension. But mentally independent individuals experience something different. Their thoughts become slower. More deliberate. More focused. Because the mind is no longer trying to manage how others see them. And once that burden disappears, clarity becomes easier to maintain. But inner peace also transforms how you experience everyday situations. Small frustrations no longer feel overwhelming. A disagreement does not ruin your day. A misunderstanding does not create emotional chaos. Because your identity is not tied to every interaction. Your stability remains internal. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of constant comparison. Comparison is one of the strongest enemies of inner peace. People constantly measure themselves against others. Their success. Their progress. Their lifestyle. And this habit creates dissatisfaction. Because someone will always appear ahead in some way. But mentally independent individuals eventually abandon comparison. They recognize that every life follows a different path. Different opportunities. Different challenges. Different timing. And once this perspective becomes clear, comparison loses its influence. Your focus returns to personal growth. To your own direction. To the life you are building. But inner peace also strengthens gratitude. Validation seeking often creates dissatisfaction. People focus on what they lack. What others have achieved. What recognition they have not yet received. But mentally independent individuals begin noticing something different. They appreciate progress. They appreciate learning. They appreciate the opportunities available in their lives. And this appreciation creates contentment. But contentment does not reduce ambition. It actually strengthens it. Because ambition driven by validation often creates pressure. But ambition driven by purpose creates fulfillment. But inner peace also changes how you approach relationships. When validation controls identity, relationships often become complicated. People try to please others constantly. They hide their real thoughts. They avoid honest conversations. But mentally independent individuals approach relationships with authenticity. They communicate openly. They respect others while maintaining their own boundaries. And this honesty creates deeper connections. Because genuine relationships cannot exist without authenticity. But inner peace also strengthens emotional patience. Many people react quickly during tension. They respond impulsively. They escalate conflicts unintentionally. But mentally independent individuals slow the emotional pace. They listen carefully. They observe the situation. They respond thoughtfully. And this calm presence often prevents problems from growing. Because emotional escalation requires participation. Without reaction, conflict loses energy. But perhaps the most important realization during this stage is this. You cannot control every situation in life. You cannot control every opinion. You cannot control how others behave. But you can control your response. And that response determines your experience of life. Because reactions shape perception. Perception shapes emotion. And emotion shapes behavior. But once reactions become thoughtful instead of automatic, life becomes calmer. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something even more profound. When inner peace becomes natural, your identity becomes stable regardless of circumstances. Success does not inflate your ego. Failure does not destroy your confidence. Criticism does not define your worth. Because your identity no longer depends on external reactions. It depends on internal alignment. Alignment between your values and your actions. Alignment between who you believe you are and how you live. And this alignment creates lasting stability. But the transformation of self-respect continues, revealing deeper insights. Because once inner peace becomes strong, something even more powerful begins appearing. A quiet form of confidence that does not need recognition to exist. And understanding this quiet confidence reveals one of the most powerful psychological truths about self-respect and personal influence. As inner peace settles into your mind, a subtle but powerful shift begins to appear in your behavior. Quiet confidence. Not loud confidence. Not the kind that tries to prove itself. Not the kind that seeks admiration. Quiet confidence is different. It does not ask for attention. It does not compete for recognition. And strangely enough, because it does not chase attention, it often attracts it naturally. Because people instinctively recognize stability. They recognize calm presence. They recognize individuals who are not trying to prove their worth. And this recognition creates influence. But quiet confidence begins with a simple psychological shift. You stop trying to control how people see you. This might sound small. But it changes everything. Many people spend enormous mental energy managing impressions. They carefully choose their words. They monitor reactions. They adjust their behavior constantly. All in an attempt to maintain approval. But mentally independent individuals abandon this exhausting process. They focus instead on clarity. Clarity in thought. Clarity in values. Clarity in action. And once behavior becomes aligned with values, confidence becomes natural. Because there is no longer a gap between who you are and how you present yourself. But quiet confidence also transforms the way you communicate. Validation seekers often over-explain themselves. They feel the need to justify decisions. They try to prevent disagreement before it happens. But mentally independent individuals communicate simply. They express their thoughts clearly. They accept that not everyone will agree. And they remain calm when disagreement appears. Because disagreement does not threaten their identity. But quiet confidence also strengthens leadership. Leadership is often misunderstood. Many people assume leadership requires authority or position. But real leadership begins with emotional stability. The ability to remain calm while others react emotionally. The ability to think clearly while others become overwhelmed. The ability to act thoughtfully while others rush impulsively. And this stability naturally attracts trust. Because people rely on those who remain steady during uncertainty. But quiet confidence also changes your relationship with success. When validation drives ambition, success becomes addictive. Each achievement must be bigger than the last. Each recognition must be stronger. And satisfaction becomes temporary. But mentally independent individuals experience success differently. Success becomes progress. Progress becomes learning. Learning becomes fulfillment. And fulfillment does not require constant recognition. But quiet confidence also transforms how you experience solitude. Many people fear being alone. Because solitude removes external feedback. Without reactions from others, validation seekers feel uncertain. But mentally independent individuals experience solitude as clarity. It becomes a space for reflection, for thinking, for creativity, for understanding life more deeply. And this comfort with solitude strengthens independence. Because your peace does not depend on constant interaction. But perhaps the most powerful transformation during this stage is the disappearance of emotional dependency. Emotional dependency occurs when your mood is controlled by others. Praise creates happiness. Criticism creates doubt. Attention creates confidence. But mentally independent individuals break this cycle. Their emotional state becomes internally regulated. They appreciate praise without needing it. They consider criticism without fearing it. They enjoy attention without depending on it. And this independence creates resilience. But quiet confidence also changes how people respond to you. Because confidence without arrogance creates respect. Calm behavior during conflict creates trust. And authenticity creates connection. But something even deeper happens here. When you stop chasing validation, you become more authentic. When you become more authentic, people understand you more clearly. When people understand you more clearly, relationships become stronger. Because authenticity eliminates confusion. But quiet confidence also strengthens decision-making. Validation seekers often hesitate. They worry about reactions. They second-guess their instincts. But mentally independent individuals trust their judgment. Not because they believe they are always correct. But because they know they can adjust if necessary. This flexibility removes the fear of mistakes. Because mistakes become learning rather than embarrassment. But perhaps the most profound truth about quiet confidence is this. It grows slowly. Through self-awareness. Through reflection. Through experience. And through repeated moments where you choose authenticity over approval. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals something extraordinary. Once quiet confidence becomes part of your character, your presence alone begins influencing environments. People feel calmer around you. Conversations become more thoughtful. Conflicts become less intense. Because emotional stability spreads quietly through behavior. But something even more important happens within you. You begin trusting yourself. Your judgment. Your instincts. Your values. And this trust becomes the foundation of self-respect. But understanding the full psychology of self-respect reveals one final truth. A truth that explains why validation-seeking traps so many people in emotional instability. And why those who break free from it experience a completely different relationship with life itself. When quiet confidence becomes natural, a final psychological shift begins forming inside the mind. Self-trust. Not blind confidence. Not stubborn certainty. But a calm trust in your ability to think, adapt, and grow. And this self-trust is the final step in escaping the need for validation. Because once you trust yourself, external approval becomes optional. Helpful sometimes. Interesting sometimes. But never necessary. Most people underestimate how powerful self-trust really is. Because without it, every decision feels uncertain. Every step forward feels risky. And every opinion from others suddenly feels extremely important. But with self-trust, the entire decision-making process becomes calmer. You gather information. You evaluate possibilities. You make the best decision available with the knowledge you have. And then you move forward. Without constantly questioning yourself afterward. But something interesting happens when self-trust develops. You stop replaying conversations in your mind. You stop analyzing every word you said. You stop wondering how others interpreted your actions. Because once a moment has passed, it no longer controls your identity. You accept that not every interaction will be perfect. And strangely enough, this acceptance creates emotional freedom. But self-trust also removes one of the biggest psychological traps people face. The trap of perfection. Perfection is often a hidden form of validation seeking. People try to avoid mistakes because they fear judgment. They hesitate to take action until everything feels flawless. But mentally independent individuals understand something important. Perfection is not required for progress. Action creates learning. Learning creates improvement. Improvement creates mastery. And mastery always begins with imperfect attempts. But self-trust also changes how you experience uncertainty. Uncertainty becomes less threatening. Because you no longer believe that every decision must be perfect. You believe something more practical. That you can adapt. That you can adjust. That you can learn if things go wrong. And this belief removes enormous pressure from your mind. But self-trust also strengthens courage. Not dramatic courage. Not reckless risk-taking. But steady courage. The courage to express your thoughts honestly. The courage to pursue goals without waiting for approval. The courage to remain authentic even when others disagree. And this courage quietly reshapes your life. Because authenticity attracts opportunities that validation-seeking often blocks. But perhaps the most interesting psychological effect of self-trust is the disappearance of emotional dependency on outcomes. Most people attach their identity to results. If something succeeds, they feel valuable. If something fails, they feel inadequate. But mentally independent individuals separate effort from identity. They focus on doing their best work. They focus on making thoughtful decisions. And they accept that outcomes sometimes depend on factors beyond control. But this perspective creates resilience. Because when identity is separate from outcomes, setbacks become temporary events. Not permanent judgments. But self-trust also reshapes ambition. Many people pursue goals primarily to gain recognition. To impress others. To prove something. But mentally independent individuals pursue goals for different reasons. Curiosity. Growth. Contribution. Purpose. And these motivations create deeper satisfaction. Because they exist regardless of applause. But self-trust also transforms your internal dialogue. Instead of harsh self-criticism, the mind becomes constructive. Instead of questioning your worth, it focuses on improvement. Instead of replaying mistakes endlessly, it extracts lessons and moves forward. And this mental shift creates emotional stability. Because your mind becomes an ally rather than an enemy. But something even deeper happens here. When self-trust becomes stable, your attention shifts away from yourself. Validation seekers constantly monitor how they appear. But mentally independent individuals focus outward. On ideas. On creativity. On meaningful goals. And this outward focus often produces better results. Because mental energy is no longer wasted on self-doubt. But self-trust also improves relationships. Because when you trust yourself, you no longer require constant reassurance from others. You communicate more clearly. You listen more patiently. You accept differences without feeling threatened. And this emotional independence creates healthier connections. But the deeper psychology of self-respect reveals one final realization. A realization that quietly transforms how you see life itself. Most people spend years trying to earn approval. Trying to prove their worth. Trying to satisfy expectations. But those who develop self-respect discover something unexpected. Your value was never something that needed proving. It was something that needed recognizing. Within yourself. Because once you recognize your own worth, the need for validation disappears. And when that need disappears, freedom begins. Freedom to think clearly. Freedom to act authentically. Freedom to live without constantly performing for approval. But this freedom also carries responsibility. Because once validation no longer controls your identity, your choices become entirely your own. And this responsibility leads to the final stage of psychological independence. A stage where your life is guided not by external expectations, but by internal clarity about who you truly are and what kind of life you want to create. And understanding this final stage reveals the deepest truth about self-respect and personal freedom. When self-trust becomes stable, something profound begins to happen. Your relationship with life itself changes. Because for most of their lives, people move through the world reacting to invisible pressure. Pressure to impress. Pressure to belong. Pressure to prove their worth. And much of this pressure is never openly discussed. It exists quietly beneath everyday behavior. In conversations. In career choices. In social interactions. Even in the smallest decisions. But once validation stops controlling your identity, this invisible pressure begins to disappear. And when it disappears, the mind becomes lighter. Because you are no longer performing. You are simply living. But this change reveals something deeper about human psychology. Most people believe they are seeking happiness. But in reality, they are seeking approval. Approval from parents. Approval from society. Approval from colleagues. Approval from strangers. And this endless pursuit of approval often replaces genuine fulfillment. Because approval is unpredictable. Sometimes it appears. Sometimes it disappears. Sometimes it changes without warning. And when identity depends on approval, emotional stability becomes fragile. But mentally independent individuals break this cycle. They no longer build their lives around approval. They build their lives around alignment. Alignment between what they believe and how they act. Alignment between their values and their decisions. Alignment between their character and their behavior. And when alignment exists, inner conflict disappears. Because the mind is no longer divided between authenticity and acceptance. But alignment also creates something powerful. Integrity. Integrity is often misunderstood as simply being honest. But psychologically, integrity means something deeper. It means your internal world and your external behavior are consistent. What you believe privately matches how you behave publicly. And this consistency creates psychological strength. Because there is nothing to hide. Nothing to defend. Nothing to pretend. But integrity also creates peace. Because pretending is exhausting. Maintaining an image requires constant attention. Constant monitoring. Constant adjustment. But authenticity requires none of this. You simply act according to your values. And this simplicity creates clarity. But perhaps the most important transformation at this stage is how you experience time. Validation seekers often live in the future. They imagine the moment when others will finally recognize their worth. The promotion. The recognition. The praise. And because they focus on these future moments, they often overlook the present. But mentally independent individuals experience time differently. They focus on the present moment. On the quality of their actions today. On the effort they apply right now. And this focus creates satisfaction. Because fulfillment is not delayed. It exists in the act of living with intention. But this perspective also reduces anxiety. Because anxiety often grows from imagined future judgments. People worry about what might happen. What others might say. What could go wrong? But mentally independent individuals focus on preparation rather than prediction. They develop skills. They develop resilience. They develop clarity. And once these qualities exist, fear of future reactions loses its influence. But something even more interesting begins happening here. When you stop seeking validation, people begin responding differently to you. Because authenticity is rare. Calm confidence is rare. And individuals who do not chase approval often appear naturally grounded. They speak less but say more. They react less but observe more. They move through situations with patience. And these qualities create respect. Not forced respect. Not demanded respect. But natural respect. Because stability attracts trust. But the deeper psychology behind this transformation is simple. When you stop trying to control how others see you, you become easier to understand. There are no hidden motives. No emotional manipulation. No attempts to gain approval. And this transparency creates stronger relationships. Because people trust what they can understand. But perhaps the most powerful realization at this stage is this. You cannot control how everyone sees you. And you do not need to. Different people will interpret your actions differently. Some will respect you. Some will misunderstand you. Some will disagree with you. And all of this is normal. Because human perception is subjective. But mentally independent individuals no longer try to control every perception. They focus on something more meaningful. Living in alignment with their values. But this alignment also creates resilience. Because criticism loses its power when identity is internal. Praise becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Rejection becomes feedback rather than humiliation. And disagreement becomes conversation rather than conflict. But this stage also reveals one final truth about self-respect. Self-respect is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you practice daily. Through your choices. Through your habits. Through your responses to life's challenges. Every moment offers a small decision. To react emotionally or respond thoughtfully. To seek approval or trust yourself. To follow pressure or follow clarity. And over time, these small decisions shape your character. But the most important insight of this entire journey is surprisingly simple. The moment you stop trying to prove your worth, you begin living from it. And that shift changes everything. Because once you live from your worth instead of chasing it, life becomes calmer. Your thoughts become clearer. Your relationships become more authentic. Your decisions become more confident. And your presence becomes stronger. Not because you forced it. But because you finally stopped seeking permission to be yourself. And that quiet freedom is the true psychology of self-respect. At the final stage of this transformation, a person begins noticing something that once seemed impossible. Life no longer feels like a constant attempt to earn worth. It begins feeling like an expression of worth. And that difference changes everything. Most people spend years trying to become enough. Enough for approval. Enough for admiration. Enough for acceptance. But the psychology of self-respect reveals a truth that quietly overturns this entire struggle. You do not become valuable by convincing others. You become powerful by no longer needing constant proof of your value. Because the need to prove yourself is often what weakens your presence. It creates pressure. It creates performance. It creates a subtle desperation that people can feel even when nothing is spoken directly. But when that need disappears, your energy changes. You become calmer. More deliberate. More grounded. And this grounded presence creates something that validation never could. Real stability. Because validation is temporary. One moment it appears. Another moment it disappears. One person gives praise. Another gives criticism. And if your identity is attached to those reactions, your emotional world remains unstable. But self-respect creates a different foundation. A private foundation. One built on self-knowledge, self-trust, and alignment. You know what you value. You know what kind of life you want to build. You know what behavior is consistent with your character. And because you know these things, outside reactions lose much of their emotional control over you. But perhaps the deepest change of all is the way you begin moving through relationships. Earlier in life, many people enter relationships hoping to be chosen. To be approved of. To be emotionally confirmed. And because of that, they often tolerate what they should question. They overgive. They over-explain. They over-adjust. All to preserve approval. But mentally independent individuals enter relationships differently. They do not ask, how can I make this person validate me? They ask something far healthier. Is this connection aligned with my values? Does this relationship support mutual respect? Can I be authentic here? And these questions protect dignity. Because self-respect does not beg to be accepted. It evaluates whether a space is worthy of your presence. That is a profound psychological reversal. And it changes the emotional structure of your life. But this final stage also transforms ambition. Ambition no longer comes from emptiness. It no longer comes from the hunger to prove worth. Instead, it comes from expression. From growth. From purpose. You pursue goals not because achievement will finally make you enough. But because creation, effort, and contribution reflect who you are becoming. And that makes ambition far more sustainable. Because it is no longer fueled by insecurity. It is fueled by meaning. But something else becomes clear here. People who stop seeking validation often become more magnetic. Not because they are trying to be. But because emotional neediness disappears. There is no subtle pressure in their energy. No constant search for approval hidden beneath every interaction. And that absence of pressure makes people feel more comfortable around them. Because calm self-respect feels safe. It feels clear. It feels trustworthy. But even more importantly, it feels real. And reality always has more power than performance. But the final lesson in the psychology of self-respect is this. You will still be misunderstood sometimes. You will still be criticized sometimes. You will still face rejection, disagreement, and moments of uncertainty. Self-respect does not remove these experiences from life. What it removes is your dependence on them. You stop needing praise to feel secure. You stop collapsing under criticism. You stop adjusting your entire identity every time the world responds unpredictably. And that is where freedom begins. Not the freedom to control everything, but the freedom to remain yourself even when things around you change. That is the real victory. To remain aligned when there is pressure to perform. To remain calm when there is pressure to explain. To remain grounded when there is pressure to prove. And once you reach that point, life begins feeling different in a way that is difficult to describe to someone still trapped in validation seeking. Because the noise becomes quieter. The fear becomes smaller. The pressure begins fading. And in that quiet space, a person finally meets themselves clearly. Not the version shaped by expectation. Not the version trained to impress. Not the version built for approval. But the real self. The self that chooses values over applause. Truth over performance. Alignment over acceptance. And once you begin living from that place, self-respect is no longer a concept. It becomes your natural state. A way of speaking. A way of deciding. A way of walking through the world. Not loudly. Not aggressively. But with a calm certainty that does not need permission to exist. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all. The people who stop seeking validation do not become cold. They become free. Free to think clearly. Free to choose honestly. Free to love without losing themselves. Free to grow without performing for an audience. And free to live from a sense of worth that no outside opinion can permanently shake. That is the psychology of self-respect. Not something borrowed from the world. Something built within. Slowly. Quietly. Deliberately. Until one day, without even realizing exactly when it happened, you stop asking the world who you are. And you begin living as if you already know.